Hi, my name is Tiffany Zhang, and I'm the founder and host of Empathy Gaps, an online YouTube video podcast. According to one of Professor Shtulman's lectures, Why Scientific Ideas Elude the Human Mind, many studies show that humans have incorrect knowledge or information about science. For example, many people believe that humans and dinosaurs coexisted and that the Earth's continents don't move, even though these statements are false. In this episode, Professor Shtulman and I will discuss why our intuitive theories about science are wrong, the implications of our wrong intuitive theories on public policy, and why children are more susceptible to misinformation and disinformation online. Here is my conversation with him. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Empathy Gaps, an online video podcast focused on creating a safe space to discuss psychology and mental health. I'm Tiffany Zhang, your host, and today we have a very special guest, Professor Shtulman. Professor Shtulman is a cognitive developmental psychologist, professor of psychology, and psychology department chair at Occidental College. Professor Shtulman, thank you so much for being here today and taking the time to join me. Before we start, is there anything else that you want to add regarding to what you do and who you are?
Uh, no, I study conceptual development, which is the development of the mind, and specifically how we acquire new concepts and form new beliefs.
Great. So before we begin the official questions, can you just please tell us about what your research focuses around on and what kind of cognitive developmental psychology means?
hmm yeah, so as I said, I study conceptual development, and within that area, I study three different things: intuition, imagination, and reflection. So the study of intuition looks at how people intuitively understand the world and how that contrasts with, say, modern scientific understanding of the world. When it comes to imagination, I look at specifically what people think is possible in the world, and the different strategies that children and adults use to judge possibility and how that influences their reasoning more generally. And then with respect to reflection, I look at how people reflect on their own thinking, especially children, and how that process improves higher order cognition more generally.
Mhm. Great. And then I guess I wanted to ask you a little about intuition since I know that's what your study focuses on. So, what are some common myths about people's intuition?
hmm well, I mean, the most common myth is that intuition is always good. You hear lots of advice of following your intuition. Your intuition knows best. That's true sometimes, but it's not always true. I mean, it really depends on the context and the domain of reasoning. So intuition tends to be based on um, early developing knowledge, things you've known for a long time. Also, it tends to be based on more superficial kinds of knowledge, like basic associations that you've built up through experience. And sometimes those are great guides for behavior, attitudes, whatever it might be. But a lot of what we learn in school is counterintuitive. It violates ideas that we've known since childhood or even since infancy. And it's also often based in a kind of logic that goes beyond just mere association. And so a lot of the academic learning we do is going to be difficult to do in the first place because it violates intuition. But even if you are successful and you learn all that new knowledge, it's difficult to deploy in the moment because intuition um, it naturally springs to mind first. That's part of what defines intuition is the first thoughts to come to mind.
Hmm. Great. And then what are, I've heard you talk about like intuitive theories. Can you kind of explain what that is and like why or like how we develop them?
hmm Um, yeah, so intuition, when it comes to the natural world, it's not a random set of ideas, but it tends to be coherent. We form little theories about how different phenomena work. So we form intuitive theories of matter, heat, motion, illness, inheritance, anything that you might encounter in your daily life that provide some kind of challenge in terms of explaining observations before you or predicting new outcomes in a situation, we rely on these theories that we've constructed. So one, concrete example is that uh, children don't wait until they go to school to figure out, what the shape of the planet is. They know they live on Earth, but they don't exactly know, what the contours of Earth are. And so, rather than have no conception of Earth and then develop a spherical notion of Earth, they develop their own intuitive models of what the Earth might be like, that take into account their experiences with the Earth, that the Earth appears flat when you look out at the horizon, and gravity appears to pull things down. So they developed essentially flat Earth models, but usually it's not. It doesn't just stick with the Earth as a plane. Usually they try to incorporate the idea that the Earth is round in some way because they hear people say that, and so instead they think that the Earth is round but has flat parts on which people live, or they think that actually the Earth is a full ball, but they live on a flat plane inside that ball. So these are the kinds of intuitive models or theories that we construct on our own. They're coherent, and we build them to make sense of the phenomena around us.
And then you also mentioned that you studied imagination. How much of like a children's imagination is in play when they're trying to develop like intuitive theories about the world?
Uh, yeah, imagination is devising a new idea, going beyond the what you've observed and what you've heard to generate something new. And here's another popular misconception. We tend to think that children's imaginations are wild and unconstrained. And as we grow up, imagination gets much more uh, routine and rudimentary, but it's actually the other way around. I mean, imagination is always grounded in knowledge. You can't imagine something without having some foundation in reality. And so imagination is extending beyond reality, but we're constrained by reality. And so because children know so much less about reality, their imaginations, only uh, extend out to a smaller degree than adults because they have so much knowledge to draw on. Um, so that, I mean, that's part of why I say a child develops an intuitive model of the Earth as being like a sphere with flat parts on which we live, because they don't have notions of geometry or ideas of perspective, how being on the Earth could give you a different perspective than being outside the Earth. They don't have any notion of physics in which gravity is a relation between objects as opposed to just a force that pulls things out. All of those components are required to to really understand that the Earth is a sphere, and because kids lack that knowledge, that it's hard for them to then imagine a spherical Earth.
hmm And then, what are kind of some limitations of our intuitive theories? And I know you talked a little bit about science and like motion and stuff. Like, what is the relationship between like intuitive theories and like our understanding of science?
Intuitive theories are inevitable. We're going to form them if we are exposed to phenomena that affect our lives in some way. So, like, we're all exposed to heat and motion and gravity and illness, etc. And we don't just like stand back in abeyance and form no opinions on the matter. Instead, we form these theories. And the theories are fueled by some innate ideas about how the world is structured that we just come to, we're born with some innate ideas, innate knowledge. It's fueled by personal experience, and it's also fueled by like the things that we hear people say. And we put all this input together to create a theory. Um, but usually it's pretty different from a scientific theory. It's qualitatively different. So because we have these theories, it makes learning science challenging because we try to incorporate what we're hearing in the classroom into this intuitive framework that's essentially built on very different foundations. We don't recognize that the foundations of the two theories are incompatible. And then, but finally, if with enough science learning and enough metacognitive activity, like actually reflecting on what you know and the shortcomings in what you know, you can acquire a scientific theory. But then what we've discovered in the last few decades of research on scientific reasoning is that the intuitive theory, so we construct a scientific theory and it coexists with the intuitive theory. And so when you're in a situation where you could rely on either theory to explain what's going on, it turns out that both theories are activated. And depending on your own personal experience with the theories, a lot of people will succumb to their intuitions rather than reason on the basis of science. And it actually takes effort to suppress the intuitive theory and privilege the scientific theory instead.
Hmm. And then how much of like our reliance on like our intuitive theory kind of explains why like people not like reject science, but why people have like many misconceptions about science?
Yeah, a lot of misconceptions are grounded in intuitive theories. A lot of adult misconceptions are the same kinds of misconceptions that children have. They sometimes they don't go away because those misconceptions are never corrected. No one, a person doesn't realize they're a misconception. But even in cases where we realize they're misconceptions, they don't go away because we don't naturally erase ideas. We just accumulate ideas. So if you don't erase the misconceptions, they could rear their head in situations where the context primes them, something someone says primes them. We're just very practiced at accessing those ideas more so than we're practiced at accessing scientific ideas. Um, and the misconceptions that actually are problematic from a social perspective. It's sort of hard to predict which misconceptions those will be. When I first started doing my research on intuitive theories, I was very focused on evolution because there were constant battles in court and in uh, public schools about teaching evolution and creationism. Um, Climate change was not something that was on anyone's mind, and it wasn't a hot button topic. But then over the next few decades, climate change became the big issue, and lots of people have misconceptions that prevent them from recognizing that it's happening and that humans are a cause of climate change. I mean, just to be a little more specific, like with climate change, the big misconception is that the weather is the climate. And so when people have a cold winter, they just dismiss climate change altogether. They're like, well, if it's snowing outside, how could the climate be getting warmer? And they don't think from a global historical perspective about change. They don't think of the Earth as a series of interrelated systems. They just think of it as a static object. And so
Hmm.
those are the kinds of misconceptions that people have always had, but they weren't a big issue politically or sociologically, but they've become so, just because of current trends.
Hmm. And you kind of touched on the kind of politicization of these topics. What are kind of the implications for of these like intuitive theories and misconceptions about science for like public policy and like lawmaking, like as you said, the evolutionary standpoint topic?
Hmm. Um, well, one implication is to recognize that a lot of people's misconceptions are deep rooted, deep seated. They arise from ideas we've had since we were children. And so, um, just confronting them in isolation probably won't fix the problem. You can tell someone, oh, weather and climate are different, and then just try to explain the differences. At the moment, that might seem to work, but that misconception is grounded in a whole set of mistaken beliefs. And so really you have to correct the entire set. Um, and then another, I guess, implication is to recognize that when people do form misconceptions, it's usually not random. Usually they'll follow patterns, patterns that um, align with our cognitive architecture, like the ways we naturally think about the world. Like
Hmm.
to give you another example, people in recent years have been very disturbed by the rise of flat Earth theories and theorists. We've always had them, but they were a fringe conspiracy. And now it seems like more and more people are adopting this flat Earth view. Um, and it feels as if it's just a bunch of some bad actors on the internet spreading rumors, or people who might be confused that are creating these YouTube channels, and getting others to join in their confusion, their skepticism. But children are flat Earth theorists, right? Like we all start out as flat Earth theorists, so it's not um, a huge uh, change in our beliefs to go from a spherical or a belief in a spherical Earth to belief in a flat Earth. We're just reverting back to beliefs we used to hold explicitly, and in many ways we still do hold implicitly.
And is it ever possible to like truly get rid of these beliefs, I guess?
Um, I don't know. As far as we can tell, no. uh, what seems to maintain a belief in your mind is whether it's useful. And so all these intuitive theories, we developed them because they were useful. They helped us understand the world around us or understand what people were saying, because oftentimes the adult vocabulary relies on certain scientific ideas that are not immediately graspable. So then we form theories to understand that language. Um, and and the usefulness never really goes away because our observations don't change and the language stays the same. So like going back to like the Earth, another misconception that people have is that the sun revolves around the Earth rather than the Earth revolving around the sun. And you can learn that the Earth is actually revolving around the sun, but it doesn't change the fact that we see the sun moving across the sky every day. It doesn't change the fact that people talk about the day-night cycle in terms of the sun rising and the sun setting. That language implies that the sun is moving, not the Earth. So it's those kinds of experiences that maintain the wrong view in our mind. Um, I think theoretically it is possible to get rid of some misconceptions if they're no longer useful. And you do see this in the history of science. There was like a whole scientific community that studied phlogiston, which was the presumed substance that allowed for fire. And then people realized, that they had chemistry wrong, and now we understand that it's oxygen that's combusting when you get fire. And phlogiston just fell out of popular consciousness. Like children don't spontaneously invent the idea of phlogiston. No one talks about phlogiston. So it's a misconception that is truly gone by the wayside. But probably the majority of our misconceptions will stick around historically and developmentally.
Yes, that makes sense. And as kind of an ending to this to our discussion about people's intuition, I kind of wanted to go back to a point where you said earlier about like people trusting their intuitions and like the kind of gut feeling that people always describe.
Mhm.
So are people's intuitions as trustworthy as people think they are, like in the larger context?
Yeah, it's really hard to say. A lot of the intuitions we develop in, say, the social world are good intuitions. Like how to read other people's expressions, body language, what are the right things to say, what are things we shouldn't be saying, um, intuitions about alliances and conflict. Um, and that's because those intuitions are grounded in reality. They're grounded in an understanding of how people work that is essentially accurate. But in other domains, our intuitions about motion, for instance, are grounded in this idea that forces are properties of objects. An object at rest has no force, and an object that's moving has a force that's been imparted to it. And that's just not true. Like that's not how forces work. Forces are relations between objects, and they cause acceleration, not motion in and of itself. So if you have some intuitions about motion, chances are that those are wrong because they are grounded in a framework that's just not. It doesn't align with reality. Um, and that's something that educators can help students with, to recognize situations where your intuitions are probably usually wrong, and other situations where it's okay to rely on your intuitions.
Yes, I really liked that response. And now I kind of wanted to pivot something, to something completely different, which is about like misinformation and children's like susceptibility to believing misinformation. So I wanted
Mhm.
to ask you like why are children more susceptible to believing like misinformation and disinformation on the internet rather than like an adult or something?
Right. Yeah, so I became interested in the problem of misinformation, specifically children's susceptibility to it when encountered online, in connection with this other area of research on reflection. It's what we know with adults is that adults who are more reflective, who think about their thinking, who pause before responding, they're also less susceptible to believing in misinformation when they encounter it online and sharing it with other people. Um, because misinformation is designed to be emotionally salient, attention capturing. And so oftentimes that elicits an immediate response of acceptance and the desire to share with others. But if you stop and think about it, you realize, this is totally implausible, or the source of this information is not credible. So we were interested in whether that's true for children as well. Is it the case that children who are more reflective are also better at differentiating true information from false information? And that seems to be the case. But that said, children have fewer defenses to work with, because one of the things that adults are doing when they're reflecting is they're drawing on a vast body of knowledge about what events are plausible in the world and what events are not. And children just have less of that knowledge. And then adults are also drawing on a vast body of information regarding sources. What are credible sources? If an article is posted on the New York Times, that's probably more credible than if it's posted on a site called prettycoolsite.com, or there's lots of like fake or scam sites out there. And adults have a sense from being on the internet of what's a reliable source and what's not. And again, children have yet to build up that body of knowledge. So, even though it is the case that reflective children are less likely to be duped by misinformation, they still have less knowledge to reflect on.
Hmm. And I wanted to ask you, do children believe misinformation more because of how convincing a message may be, or is it just because the internet has like an inherent sense of credibility?
Oh, I definitely think it's the latter. One surprising finding on children's imagination is that they're actually more skeptical than we give them credit for. We tend to think children will believe anything. They're very open-minded. In fact, many people think they're gullible. But it's the exact opposite. Children tend to reject true facts about the world if those facts lie too far from what they already know to be true. Um, so, for instance, if you ask a child, could a person walk on water? They'll say no, and that would be the right answer. But if you ask them, could a person find an alligator under their bed? No, just violates what they know about animals, alligators in particular, about houses and beds. And they just think it's outside the realm of possibility. Whereas adults recognize that that's a very unlikely thing to happen, but still recognize it could happen. So, yeah, children are naturally skeptical. And so when they encounter a crazy story on the internet, they are skeptical of it. But the problem with encountering information on the internet is that it is framed as if it were true. Right? It has the formatting that is the same as true news that you would find on the internet. Um, it appears in the same feeds as true news. Oftentimes, it has social validation in the forms of likes and comments and having been shared by other people. So there's a lot of these peripheral features of misinformation that will counter children's skepticism and cause them probably to believe in the misinformation to some extent.
Yeah, so that makes a lot of sense. I feel like information that is crucial for telling whether something is fake or true is usually absent on the internet, like as you said. Like it's in the same format as true news and stuff. So I think what you said was really interesting. And I guess like how can we teach children and like people in general and to build media literacy skills to combat like the misinformation on the internet.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a matter of tapping into children's natural skepticism. Um, it it is a little bit mysterious why children accept printed information and information on the internet as true. Like they have their default is to reject unusual, extraordinary ideas, but then the medium can then override the default. So we just need to get them back to the default. Um, one study that I think is particularly useful to think about in this context was one where they presented children with these ambiguous animals that were, say, a hybrid of a fish and a bird. And the hybrids were made so they looked mostly like one animal and a little bit like another animal. So it was something that looked mostly like a fish, but a little bit like a bird. And when they saw these animals and a human was presenting them to them and said, oh, that's a bird, children would just reject what they heard. They could see with their own eyes it looked much more like a fish than a bird, and they wouldn't believe the person right next to them who claimed it was a bird. But when that same picture is presented to them with a printed label at the bottom that says bird, then they'll accept it. So it's going from like spoken language to written language that immediately changes their evaluation of counterintuitive ideas. Um, so it's probably because as children they're outsiders to this world of text and books and the internet, and they see that the adult world operates on the basis of these features, and so something about this new way of interacting with the world and knowing the world leads them to believe that it's immediately credible. So we have to then teach them, like, actually there's many ways in which false information can be written about or transmitted on the internet. And I think that's the starting point, but obviously that's not enough, because say your average middle schooler realizes that false information could be transmitted on the internet. The next stage is to really help children think about sources, because sources are really what um, allow you to differentiate reliable information from unreliable information. And you have to think about, like, where's this information coming from? How is it being reported? Is the information sensational in the way that it's being conveyed to me? Is it trying to elicit emotions? Is it trying to sway my opinion? That's one sign that it might not be reliable. Um, and is it coming from an organization that's known for good journalistic practices in terms of how they investigate a story, how they proof check, proofread, and fact check information. All of that is sort of stuff that's behind the scenes. You wouldn't know about it just by looking at a web page or looking at a news feed, but it's about the mechanics of how information is uh, reported and curated that kids need to learn about.
Yeah, I think combating kids and people in general with media literacy skills is super important. And I wanted to ask you, like, how I guess social media has affected the cognitive processes in adolescents and children, and if so, like, in what ways?
Um, well, there's a lot of evidence coming out that social media is negatively impacting adolescents' mental health, leading to depression and anxiety. And it's particularly impactful for females more so than males, partially because of the social comparison aspect that seems to hit females harder than it does males. Um, there's this great book called The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt, where he summarizes all the studies that have been done up to this point, and it shows really there's been a huge increase in mental illness that can be linked directly to not just social media, but social media combined with smartphones. Because social media has been around for quite a while at this point, but people used to access it on their computer, and then they only accessed it occasionally. They didn't spend all day with social media. But now, because you can access it on your phone, and you can post so much more easily, and also manipulate your posts through like image filters and so forth. Now it's creating a toxic environment in which adolescents are getting totally mired.
Mhm. And that was kind of the last question that I wanted to ask you. So thank you so much again for coming on and speaking with me. I feel like we covered a lot. And to everyone watching at home, thank you so much for watching, and I will see everyone next time. Bye.
Thank you.